We will worship him alone. He is Lord of heaven, Lord of earth. He is Lord of all who live. He is Lord above the universe. All praise to him we give. Hallelujah to the King of Kings. Hallelujah to the Lamb. Hallelujah to the Lord of Lords, who is the great I am. I have found a friend in Jesus. He's everything to me. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. The lily of the valley, in him alone I see. All I need to cleanse and make me fully whole. In sorrow he's my comfort, in trouble he's my stay. He tells me every care on him to roll. He's the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. He all my griefs has taken, and all my sorrows borne. In temptation he's my strong and mighty tower. I have all for him forsaken, and all my idols torn from my heart, and now he keeps me by his power. Though all the world forsake me, and Satan tempt me sore, through Jesus I shall safely reach the goal. He's the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. He will never, never leave me, nor yet forsake me here, while I live by faith and do his blessed will. A wall of fire about me, I've nothing now to fear. With his manna he my hungry soul shall fill. Then sweeping up to glory, to see his blessed face, where rivers of delight shall ever roll. He's the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. If you're able, let's stand for prayer, please. Dear Heavenly Father, we come before you this evening and ask you to be with us, that you would strengthen our hearts and minds through your word, Father, presented to us. We might take it and use it in our lives and share it with others. Father, I ask you to give all those who are physically hurting, Carl, Richard, all those I can't remember. Be with them and help them, Father, and help those also that need your prayers. Sure, Father. You might do say something that would help them. Leave us now as we continue. Do us for our sins. We ask all things in Jesus' name. Amen. Zion's call sweetly rings over land and sea, bidding us look to realms above. While the light from the throne shines for you and me, let us listen to his call of love. Zion's call is ringing, coming from the throne above. While we hear it ringing, let us heed the call
Well, if you have your paper from last week, that might be handy because most of the slides were on there. I didn't print them again because most of them were on the one from last week. We didn't get very far, at least as far as the papers had planned. We made it to 1 Kings, though, and we made it, I guess, technically to chapter 3 of 1 Kings. Solomon, we looked at the very end at just very quickly at Solomon. He and his father were they were different types of men. David was a real man's man kind of person, a fighter, a warrior, a war hero. Solomon was sort of a different sort. He was a learner, a poet eventually, a writer, a student, I guess. And so naturally his kingdom was a little bit different by nature because he was different. His kingdom and his kingship ended up being quite a bit different. Of course, what is Solomon most known for? Wisdom. He is known for his wisdom. And that's where we'll start in chapter 3. He prays for wisdom. So, like David, his father, and like Saul before him, Solomon started very strong. He had a good start to his kingship, to his reign. He prayed to God, and he asked for wisdom. The chapter opens up just by, really it opens up with a not so great thing, that he made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And that might be a little hint of what his habit and pattern ends up being, that ends up becoming his downfall. But it says, the people were sacrificing at the high places because no house had yet been built for the name of Jehovah. So that was their reasoning, at least, why they were now they were sacrificing to Jehovah at the high places. But it says Solomon loved Jehovah, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places, and that's sort of setting up the temple being built by him. But he prays to God. Of all the things he could have asked for, he prays for wisdom. He says, I'm a little child. He wasn't really a little child, but that's how he viewed himself. He said, I don't know how to be a king. So please give me wisdom so that I may discern between good and evil. Whoops. He said, notice very carefully in verse 9 what he asks for specifically. He says, give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this your great people? So what was he wanting? What was he asking for? Wisdom in what way? What kind? He was asking for the wisdom to be able to discern and be a good governor, somebody who governs the people. That was what he was primarily concerned about. I need to be able to have the skill to decide or determine between things, to discern good and evil, to make the right decisions as a leader of a nation. So if two people come to me, which, by the way, is about to happen, just as a sampling, I need to be able to discern and figure out how to make the right judgment. And verse 10 says that God was very pleased with that request. And so he tells him, because you didn't ask for riches or a long life or anything physical like that, I'm going to give you what you asked for, but I'm also going to give you those things. That's a pretty good deal. Of course, Solomon didn't know that that was going to be the case, or else it wouldn't have really been that special of a thing that he did. But he also says, if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. So, that was God's covenant to Solomon, his promise to him, or his condition. Matthew Henry says, Solomon had wisdom and understanding, exceeding much, great knowledge of distant countries and the histories, a quickness of thought, strength of memory, and a clearness of judgment such as never any man had. He was the best at that kind of thing. His wisdom in that sense. It was a judicial type of wisdom. And it's demonstrated then. We see where he prays for wisdom. Now we see just one little sampling when two women come to him, both claiming that this baby is theirs. Now, how could a man in Solomon's position have any way of knowing which one is actually the mother? There's no possible way, is there? There's no maternity tests back then. There's no way to know. Both of them are claiming that the woman, the baby is theirs. And it's a very tragic thing, you know. The woman accidentally smothered her baby in the bed. And apparently she stole this other baby. And here they are, both claiming that the baby's theirs. So what Solomon ends up doing, and it's kind of hard for us to really understand some of the details in this situation, okay? But whenever we think about the fact that this is to prove that Solomon was wise judicially, he got what he asked for, he figures out a way to determine which one's the real mother. Now, if you read this account, the first thing that pops into my mind is, how could this woman not care if that baby's cut in half? So somebody that doesn't really believe the Bible, or somebody that wants to charge against him, might say, this is the dumbest thing I've ever read. If he said he's going to cut the baby in half, the one lady is not, the one that's not the mother is not going to say, okay, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with half the baby. So why was Solomon so wise? Well, there's some details we were not given. What we do know is that what he did allowed him to see. He saw something in the woman that was really the mother. Maybe not exactly as black and white as one of the women was okay with it and one of them wasn't. But when he said this, he could see in the mother. And at any rate, the woman that happened to be the real mother was more deserving of the child anyway. I mean, he saw which woman deserved to have this baby, and it happened to be because God had given him wisdom. It was the real mother. So that was just the way that he decided to figure out which one was the real mother, because there's absolutely no possible way that he could have done it otherwise. And this was also a very quick way to find out. Of course, they could have said, okay, let us talk to your relatives and your friends and everybody you know, and we'll get all this, weeks-long situation going. Or, right here, he solved it just like that, on the spot. So, yeah, that was a pretty wise move. So that is recorded just to give us a sampling of what Solomon's wisdom was. We're given also an account of the borders of his realm, and it is really general, but it's also the borders of that God ever promised to give them. Eventually, it is believed that that this all the way up here, for at least a short time. So we already looked at Joshua 11:43, where it says God gave the Israelites all the land that He ever promised to give that He promised to their fathers, that He swore to their fathers that He would give them. Well, they had it according to that verse, even in Joshua's day, but they certainly had it at least by Solomon's day. So the claim that they have never possessed the land to the extent that God promised is not true. It goes directly contrary to the Bible. Well, we already looked at this. I got ahead of myself. What happened? Okay. Here's a map again. Okay, that looks better. Mm-hmm.
Back to the two women. The child, for both were sons. And so sons, wouldn't they care for their mothers? They were the ones, the males were the ones that made money, were heads of households. So if they ever became widows, the sons would take care of them. So the one, obviously, only cared about the son for what it was in it for her, whereas the other mother cared for the child, for who he was. And if you only care for yourself, it's like she was jealous and covetous of another woman's blessings.
That's what it seems like.
Right.
Yeah, she had a bitter.
And that kind of bitterness you can't help but see, I think.
Yeah, he clearly could see, and that's the kind of thing, he wouldn't have been able to, like I said, there's no way for him to make this call in this situation. That's what he said. One says it's hers, the other says it's hers. Well, I mean, what in the world are we supposed to do? So he did something that he could see it. And that wisdom that God gave him allowed him to discern, just like he asked. He wanted to be able to discern. And he did discern, and he made the right decision. And it says they stood in awe of him because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. So, again, that is I don't want to say the extent of his wisdom, but that is what he asked for, and that's what the text says God gave him. And the reason I make that clarification is because it's going to come back up. Whether or not he had wisdom, after all, will certainly be a question that we might ask. I'm not ready for that yet. So in chapter 5, preparations begin for building the temple. Chapter 4, I sort of skipped over the last part that tells about his wealth. That was the other thing. He was known for his wisdom, and he's known for his wealth. He had wealth because he asked for wisdom. God gave him wealth as well. What we're going to notice, though, is that while God did give him wealth, he also gave himself some wealth on top of it, and a lot of it. There were some things that we pointed out this morning with David that God had told them the kings shall not multiply to themselves. Remember what they were? Some of them? With David, what did we point out? Wives. Do not multiply wives for yourselves. Another one was horses. And another one was money. Guess which one Solomon did? All of them. He multiplied wives. He multiplied horses. He multiplied gold and silver, in addition to what God had granted him. And that was going to end up being what brought his kingdom down, was that very thing. Also, it says he had more wisdom than all the people of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. The east would be Mesopotamia. That's where Balaam was from. So they were known for being wise in that way. And then Egypt, they were supposed to be the ones who had all this medicinal knowledge and all this stuff. Solomon had more wisdom than the two powerhouses of wisdom and knowledge. So that was saying quite a bit, in addition to his wealth. So astronomy, like in the East, astrology, and then the Egyptians, like geometry and math, and also astronomy and astrology, and the ointments and medicine and natural science. Solomon's wisdom surpassed all of that, according to the text. The last, verses 29 through 31 of chapter 4. So the kingdom of Israel under Solomon became the most materialistically magnificent kingdom in the whole world. And the income is just staggering, to be honest, based on some calculations of getting an idea of what kind of monetary value some of this stuff would have today to us. Let me double check and make sure I don't have okay. Thought I had a slide out of order here. In chapter 5, preparing for the temple, Solomon sends word to Hiram. Okay? Who's Hiram? He's the king of Tyre. I'm tempted to go back to the map, but I won't. Tyre's up in the northwest on the coast, north of Israel. So they had a connection with Tyre, had an alliance, I guess you'd say. He sends word to Hiram, and he tells him, my father couldn't build a house for Jehovah our God, but Jehovah has given me rest, so I'm going to do it, and I need your help. I need some cedars. I need cedar wood from Lebanon. Almost every time you'll read about cedar in the Old Testament, it is most likely going to be connected to Lebanon, because that was the place. That's where you want to get your wood. They were renowned for their cedar, the quality, I guess, and whatever goes along with that. Cedars from Lebanon. So sometimes God would rebuke the people and say, you've got these beautiful homes with cedars from Lebanon and all this stuff. It's like the best of the best. That's what Solomon wants for the house of God, that God didn't care about or want, by the way. Remember, don't ever forget that. But he had the right, they had good intentions, but God didn't really care. He doesn't care about cedar from Lebanon. Why would he care about cedar from Lebanon? Or anything, silver, gold, any of that stuff. So I'll just read this quote. It says, Solomon tells Hiram that peace gave him an opportunity to build the temple. Therefore, he resolved to set about it immediately. God has given me rest both at home and abroad. There is no adversary, no Satan. At least that's the word, adversary. No instrument of Satan to oppose it or to divert us from it. Satan does all he can to hinder temple work. Now, this is Matthew Henry, you sort of spiritually applying this concept. Satan does all he can to hinder temple work. But when he is bound, we should be busy. When he is bound, we should be busy. When there's no evil occurrent, then let us be vigorous and zealous in that which is good and get it forward. That's a pretty good advice. The devil will do anything he can to hinder us from doing God's work. But we need to take an opportunity, just like he'll take an opportunity to stop us if we let him, when we're idle. When he is bound, so to speak, he's using that figuratively based on Revelation 20, we need to be busy. Take the opportunity to work against his operations. Kaufman said this about Solomon, and I guess a disclaimer. Kaufman's pretty hard on Solomon. I don't cut Solomon very much slack personally, but Kaufman, among all commentators that I've seen, is exceedingly harsh, I guess. But he says, The materialistic trappings of the Solomonic kingdom exhibited all the extravagant abuses of excessively big government, outrageous and oppressive taxation, great battalions of forced labor, and a bloated military establishment, to say nothing of his enormous multiplication of personal wealth and his sensual indulgence of his lust in cohabiting with 1,000 pagan women. Well, he's not wrong. Just look at chapter 4. Yes, God gave him a lot of this wealth, but not all of it. Much of it, he multiplied and multiplied. How does a king get money anyway? Okay, there's one way. There's pretty much just two ways. He either goes somewhere and conquers it and takes all their money, or he taxes his own people and gets it from them. So the only way a king can get money is by taking it from somebody. It's not like they're going and working somewhere and, making an honest dollar. They got to take it from people. Well, Solomon, we already pointed out, the specific thing that was different about Solomon from his father was he didn't go and conquer places. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a soldier. So he got it the other way from the people of Israel. You know how we know this? Because the people said it. Whenever his son was going to be taking his place, the people and the elders came to him and said, look, your father, his taxes were too hard. Lower them. Give us a break. Getting ahead of ourselves, but they said, your father really was too heavy, too hard. That's how he built this temple the way that he did. And that's how much of this wealth, he multiplied it, and he really tore the kingdom apart because of it. So, I thought I had another part of that, but I guess I don't. So this luxury really led to the weakening of the kingdom, unfortunately. So while many people see this as, such a glorious thing, Solomon's kingdom is a picture of Christ's kingdom and all its glory, I don't really see the Old Testament presenting it in the later stages, at least, as this glorious preview of anything. It destroyed the kingdom. It really destroyed it. It tore it apart. And his son really, gave the people the straw that broke the camel's back, as they say. Mm-hmm.
But don't you think this also depicts what you were talking about in this morning's lesson? Abraham was given a son, and instead of trusting in the fact that God gave him a son, he was willing to kill him, knowing that God would send it back. Whereas Solomon was blessed by God with wisdom and riches, and then he began trusting in the very blessings that God gave him. In other words, if you're not thankful and know where your blessings come from, you're doomed.
Yep.
And that's what happened to Solomon.
It's definitely what it seems like. He lost sight of that.
His blessings became his idols.
Yep. He turned it into a curse. He did. I mean, and he was directly contradicting God's will as he went with this multiplication of all these things. You shall not do this. So he builds the temple. That's chapters 5 through 8. Then he builds his palace. Then he furnishes the temple. I mean, very much detail. Then the ark is brought into the temple. It had already been brought into the city, but now it's brought into the temple because now the temple's built. Interesting fact. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 9. Remember the three things that were in the ark? There were three things. Aaron's rod, tablets of stone, and manna. 1 Kings 8, 9. What was in the ark?
Except the 2 tablets.
Nothing but the 2 tablets. That's interesting, isn't it? Where'd the rod go? I don't know. Where'd the manna go? I don't know. So even at this time, those two things were they weren't there anymore by the time the ark got to the temple. Just a little fun, interesting fact. So if somebody, asks you what three items were in the ark, you need to say, well, when? When do you mean? Trick question. I'm not falling for that. And they'll probably say, what do you mean? And then you can tell them, look at that. Those things were in there. But anyway, chapter 9, God gives them a warning. Some if-then statements that are very important, not only for an understanding of the kingdom of Israel in the Old Testament, but for us today. If you walk before me as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I've commanded you and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish a royal throne over Israel forever. Then he says, but I bet you could guess the next thing. Basically, but if you do the opposite, if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I've given them, and the house that I've consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight. Though this house is so high, yet everyone that passes by shall be astonished and shall hiss. So, yes, I've consecrated my name to this place. Yes, or I've consecrated this place to my name. Yes, I've established your kingdom, but if you turn aside from my commandments, which he's already started to do, it won't last. And he's not even talking about his kingdom necessarily. He says, I'll cut off Israel if you and the people turn away from me. In fact, he doesn't even say and the people. He says if you and your children or your children don't keep my commandments, I'll cut off Israel from the land that I gave them. This is why the Israelites eventually gave up their claim to that land. They don't have any claim. They didn't in Jesus' day, if you want to be strictly technical, they had already given up their kingdom. They never became a kingdom again. Once they go into Babylonian captivity, they never got it back and never will. God never said they would. They were never an independent nation, and it will never exist again. God already has his nation. It's called the church. It's Israel, according to the New Testament. If we believe the New Testament is inspired of God, we have to believe the church is Israel now. It's not just something that's side by side with Israel. It is Israel, and it's the only Israel. So this house will become a heap of ruins. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 24:2? Whenever the apostle said, hey, look how great this temple is. Isn't it magnificent? He said, there will not be one stone left upon another. This house will become a heap of ruins. And that's the very thing that the Jews could not let go. This guy said that he's going to destroy the temple, or that this temple is going to be destroyed. And God himself said it, if they turn away from following his commandments. And so it is today. If we turn away, then that's how it'll be for us. If a congregation of his church turns away, God cuts them off. If I turn away, God cuts me off. It's always been that way. It's very simple. Very straightforward. God doesn't change his principles in that way. Some of the specifics have changed, but not the general principle. If this, then that. If this, then that. So, sadly for Solomon and the kingdom, he did that. He chose that, and so God carried out his promise. He did a lot of other things. I can't help but point out verses like chapter 9, verse 15. the forced labor that King Solomon drafted to build the temple? Forced labor? Has anybody ever enjoyed forced labor ever in the history of mankind? I think that's why they call it forced labor, because it's labor that somebody forces you to do. If you wanted to do it, you wouldn't have to be forced to do it. But Solomon drafted forced labor to build the house of Jehovah and his own house and all this other stuff. Here were verse 23, these were the chief officers who were over Solomon's work, 550 who had charge of the people who carried on the work. So he had 550 officers. So how many workers did they have to have? They got to have 550 chief officers who were over the work. This is a massive undertaking that was not anything that God commanded or even wanted, like we said. So, chapter 11 is perhaps in some of the most tragic things that we can read, spiritually speaking, especially verse 4. Verse 1 says, "Now King Solomon loved many foreign women." That's great, isn't it? Along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite women, Ammonite women, Edomite women, Sidonian women, and Hittite women. Well, it seems like he didn't really love many Israelite women. But then again, what could Solomon gain by marrying foreign women that he couldn't gain by marrying Israelite women? Okay, land, maybe. The alliances. Every single marriage was probably strategically chosen to be connected to somebody, some foreign administration. That's probably why Israelite women aren't mentioned. He may have had Israelite wives. I'm sure he did. How could he not if he had as many as it says he had? But his main objective was foreign women, and that's probably why. Which sort of goes along with multiplying to yourself not just wives, but whatever those wives were offering in a political sense. They were political marriages. And some of David's probably were too. But the problem with this, among other things, is that God had said specifically, not only not to multiply wives to yourselves, but don't marry the foreign women, not because they're foreign. There seems to be some people today that don't understand that, and they think that that's still a thing today. Interracial marriage. You're not supposed to do that. That's unbiblical, because God said don't marry those foreign people. Well, it wasn't the foreignness. It wasn't that they were foreign. God said don't marry those people because they'll turn your heart away from me. So it wasn't that they were foreign. It was that they were pagan. They were idolaters. They had false gods. And so all these women were worshipers of false gods. And Solomon married them, took them as wives, and guess what ended up happening? Surprise, surprise, God's right again. Anybody surprised? Every time He's right. Man has a hard time catching on to that. I guess it's kind of like a teenager when their parent says, don't do this because this is what's going to happen. And they think, what do they know? That happened to them, somebody else, but that won't happen to me. And then it happens. Well, Solomon did this, even though God said don't. And verse 4, the saddest words of verse 4 are not that they turned his heart away from God, after other gods. Whoops. The saddest words are that it happened when he was old. This happened when he was old. And the reason those words are so sad is because we don't ever read anything about him coming back around. He lived his whole life, and he seems to have had a pretty long life. And it wasn't until he was old. How old is old? Old. That's all I know. But if you're going to specify it, apparently it would indicate pretty significant age. When he was old, it was near the end of his life that his heart turned away after other gods. His heart was not wholly true to Jehovah his God, as was the heart of David his father. He went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians. He went after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. He did what was evil in the sight of Jehovah and did not wholly follow Jehovah as David his father had done. He built a high place for Chemosh. By the way, Ashtoreth was the goddess of sexual love and maternity and fertility. Milcom was another form of Malcolm, which was also another name for Molech. Anybody know who Molech was? What was Yes. Child sacrifice. That's what Molech loved. Of course, Molech was nothing, nobody. He wasn't anything imaginary. But this is human sacrifice, especially little children. Solomon built a high place for Molech. The ESV actually says Molech in verse 7. It's hard to imagine that kind of thing. Chemosh was the twin brother of Molech, so supposedly. But God says, and by the way, look at verse 8. He did this for all his foreign wives. So, technically speaking, if he didn't have those foreign wives, he would have never done this, because he did it for them. He didn't turn their hearts to Jehovah. They turned his heart to their gods. That's exactly what God said would happen if they married them. If they married these foreign pagan women. And Jehovah was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from Jehovah, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what Jehovah commanded. He says, since this has been your practice and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. But for the sake of David, I'm not going to do it in your days. I'll tear it out of the hand of your son. Isn't that interesting? He doesn't say, as he does on other occasions to other kings, that I'm not going to do it in your days because you did this or this. He says, I loved your father so much that I'm not even going to do it in your day. I'm going to do it in your son's day. And now guess what God did? Remember what Solomon told the king of Tyre? God's given me rest. I don't have any adversaries. Now guess what happens? Verse 14 says, Jehovah raised up an adversary. Hadad, the Edomite. So now things are not so peaceful, not so great as they were before. He was an adversary all of Israel, all the days of Solomon. Another one, that is.
In these chapters, it reads that God talks directly to Solomon, not through prophets or not through anybody. I find that interesting.
Yeah, it is.
He's still, I would think that would pretty well shake you in your boots to straighten out.
Yeah. Yeah, and the text said he was angry with Solomon who had appeared to him twice, and then right after that it says he said to Solomon, so almost it sounds like a third time. Now he could have said that through a person, but it doesn't indicate that it was through a medium like that. So the assumption is that he told him directly. So yeah, you would think. But then again, when it gets in your heart, it can really mess you up. Just like we saw with David this morning. It's believed that the book of Ecclesiastes was written when Solomon was old. And that's significant. In my personal opinion, it helps to clarify a lot of the things that are said in the book of Ecclesiastes. Because Ecclesiastes is a book that throws a lot of people off. They don't know what to do with it. Because it doesn't sound right, does it? I mean, it sounds very pessimistic and depressing. Did this, vanity. Did this, vanity. Life, all of life is vanity. The whole thing's vanity. You do this, it's vain. No point. Wickedness, no point. Righteousness, no point. Don't be too righteous, you'll get killed. Don't be too wicked, you'll get killed. So what should you be? I mean, it's like, it's tough. Well, when we think about Solomon's position, if he did write it when he was old, it makes a little bit more sense. It's sad, and it seems like it'd be an inspired record of what an outlook of life is whenever you turn away from God and your heart is after other gods. Mm-hmm.
He does conclude.
Yes, the conclusion is a very high point, yes. Fear God.
But at the same time, God is not a respecter of persons. He left Saul to Satan and horrible spirits. At this point, he doesn't seem to leave Solomon. He just makes Solomon face the consequences of his behavior.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? That's why God is still talking to him.
Yeah.
With Saul, it's like, I'm done with you.
Yeah, he did. And he tells him, I'm going to tear the kingdom from you, just like he told Saul. And then he raised up an adversary against him. And he does seem to have kind of split after that. I mean, it doesn't say that he comes to him anymore or talks to him. But he does say, I'm going to delay this until your son takes your place. So the implication is, you're going to die a normal death. And then, when your son takes your place, the kingdom is going to be torn out of his hand. That's exactly what ends up happening. His son was Rehoboam. But this man, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, comes into the picture here. And we'll get into that, Lord willing, next time. But I'm going to, we'll look at this quote. It's a fairly lengthy quote. It might be a record breaker for the most lengthy quote I'll ever read. But it says, the sacred narrative expressly states that the polygamy of Solomon, and especially his alliances with nations excluded from intermarriage with Israel, was the occasion, if not the cause, of his later sin and punishment. Thus, the sin of the people, embodied, as it were, in the person of their representative, carried national judgment as its consequence. But the elements which caused the fall of Solomon lay deeper than polygamy. Indeed, the latter was among the effects as well as one of the further causes of his spiritual decline. He says, first among these elements of evil at work, we reckon the growing luxury of the court. The whole atmosphere was different from what it had been in the primitive times before his reign, like in Deuteronomy. Everything, he says, this is Alfred Edersheim, by the way, everything had become un-Jewish. Closely connected with this was the evident desire to emulate and even outdo neighboring nations. Such wisdom, such splendor, such wisdom, such splendor, such riches, and finally such luxury and such a court were not to be found elsewhere as in the kingdom of which Jerusalem was the capital. An ominous beginning of that long course of Jewish pride and self-exaltation which led to such fearful consequences. And he says, moreover, we may infer that the chief object of his great harem was to strengthen his position, like we pointed out with the alliances, to give evidence of his wealth and power as an eastern monarch, and to form promising alliances no matter what spiritual elements were introduced into the country. And they definitely were introduced into the country because of these. Closely connected with all this was the rapidly growing intercourse between Israel and foreign nations. For one reason or another, strangers whom Israel hitherto had only considered as heathens crowded to Jerusalem. And they weren't coming to Jerusalem to become Jewish proselytes. They were coming to Jerusalem and turning the Israelites into people like them. By their presence, king and people would not only become familiar with foreign ideas, but so-called toleration would extend to these strangers the right of public worship, or rather public idolatry. That's exactly what happened. Solomon said, not only do we tolerate it, but here, I'll build you some places to do it. And I'll even do it with you. So strong was this feeling that the high places which Solomon had built on the southeastern acclivity of the Mount of Olives remained in use till the time of Josiah. Viewed in connection with what has just been stated, even the intellectual culture in the time of Solomon may have proved a source of serious danger. The kingdom just fell apart under Solomon. God's blessings to him had turned into a curse. Another commentator said Solomon's idolatry consisted merely in a syncretic mixture of Jehovah worship and idolatry, by which the worship which should be paid solely and exclusively to the true God was not only injured, but was even turned into idolatry itself. If we try to worship God in a mixture of other forms of worship, we're not worshiping God anymore. Even if we think we are, even if we truly with all our heart want God to get the glory, if we do it in a way that He does not approve, it's not for Him anymore, is it? Well, it's not, according to God. And we see an example of that with Old Testament worship, when they would try to mix it with other forms of worship. Can't worship God and false gods. God's purpose would be carried out despite Solomon's disobedience. The house of David would be disciplined but not destroyed. Solomon indeed had proved to be a sinner, yet through the line of David, Christ, the Savior of sinners, should appear. We should be thankful to God that He did not destroy the house of David, like He destroyed the house of Saul. Because if He had, we would be doomed. We'd be hopeless. No Christ if He did that. But He loves, according to His words, He loves David so much He wasn't going to do it in Solomon's day. But He loves us so much He wasn't going to destroy David's house at all. Not completely, I mean. And again, Edersheim says, Solomon had done more than any other king to denationalize Israel. He says, on the morrow of his death, rebellion within the land, outside its borders, Edom and Syria were ready to spring to arms. Egypt was gathering up its might, and only Rehoboam to hold the rudder of the state in the rising storm. And I'll give you a hint. Rehoboam did not do a very good job at all. He did not have a good start or a good finish. If you're going to give a faltering kingdom into the hands of somebody, Rehoboam is not the kind of man you wanted to give it to. Because it's like giving a precious, fragile heirloom, please take good care of this, and you give it to him, and boom, there it goes on the floor immediately. That's what Rehoboam did, and is very tragic. So that is how the chapter ends. Solomon reigned in Jerusalem for 40 years. He slept with his fathers and was buried. Another one of these phrases that shows those two things as two separate things. And Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. Next week we'll start with chapter 12 and what would happen next. But again, can't help but point out, where is the repentance of Solomon? Where it's not recorded. I can't help but imagine if he had repented, it would certainly be there. Somewhere. It would certainly be recorded. Because that would be a very important thing to know and a source of encouragement. Even if you go this deep, you can still come back. David came back from his mess up. So many others did. But Solomon, and again, I think it all goes back to chapter 11, verse 4. When he was old, his heart turned away. And then he died. And it is as tragic as it can be. Heed God's warning when it comes to spiritual things like that. If we surround ourselves with pagan persons, then we can only expect to be corrupted by them. Any thoughts or comments? All right, if anybody needs to respond to the invitation, you have that opportunity. We encourage you to do it before it's too late as we stand together and sing.
My spirit, O Lord, I need restored. My heart is weary, please help me, dear Lord. I stand in need of more, straight from your word. Renew my love, rebuild my faith, oh, restore my soul. Revive the fire, Lord, deep in my soul. Stir my desire to work in your fold. Light in my heart, dear God, your zeal grown cold. Renew my love, rebuild my faith, oh, restore